White initiates with a king-pawn push, opening lines for the queen and bishop, setting a dynamic balance. Black mirrors White's central pawn advance, maintaining the dynamic balance and opening lines for their own pieces. White develops a knight towards the center, a solid move that supports the central pawn structure and prepares kingside castling. Black develops a knight, contesting the center and developing a piece actively, maintaining the dynamic balance. White opts for the Ruy-Lopez opening, targeting Black's king-pawn and preparing to exchange pieces strategically. Black challenges the bishop's placement with a pawn advance, a solid move that forces White's hand. White retreats the bishop, maintaining the pin and the pressure on Black's kingside structure. Black develops the king's knight, challenging White's central pawn and preparing for castling. White castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to mobilize the center with pawn advances. Black solidifies the center with a pawn push, improving pawn structure and preparing for potential central play. White exchanges the bishop for a knight, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and gain a favorable endgame. Black recaptures with the b-pawn, creating doubled c-pawns but opening the b-file for potential rook activity. White advances the d-pawn, opening the center and preparing to challenge Black's pawn chain. Black captures the d-pawn, opening the center and simplifying the pawn structure. White recaptures with the knight, centralizing the piece and maintaining control of key central squares. Black pushes the c-pawn, challenging White's knight and aiming to break open the center. The move the knight to f3 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to c6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the queen to d7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to e1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black develops the bishop, activating the piece and preparing for kingside castling. White develops the knight, reinforcing the center and preparing for further central pawn play. Black castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to coordinate pieces for the middle game. White places the rook on the e-file, preparing to contest the open file and control central squares. Black develops the bishop to the queenside, connecting the rooks and preparing for future play on the queenside. White develops the bishop to, pinning Black's knight and increasing pressure on the queenside. Black challenges the bishop with a pawn push, forcing a decision and potentially disrupting White's pieces. White retreats the bishop, maintaining the pin and keeping options open for central play. Black repositions the rook to the e-file, contesting the open file and preparing for potential exchanges. White pushes the e-pawn, challenging Black's central pawn and aiming to open lines. Black captures the e-pawn, opening the e-file and simplifying the central pawn structure. White recaptures with the rook, occupying the open e-file and placing pressure on Black's position. The move the queen takes on d1 with check by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the queen to e2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on f3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the g-file takes on f3, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the queen to c6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to f4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White recaptures with the rook, maintaining control of the e-file and preparing for the endgame. Black develops the bishop too, centralizing the piece and preparing for potential pawn breaks. White exchanges rooks, simplifying the position and reducing black's attacking potential. Black recaptures with the knight, developing the piece and reinforcing the central pawn structure. White maneuvers the knight too, repositioning it for better control of central squares. Black develops the bishop too, centralizing the piece and improving its scope. White moves the knight too, improving its position and preparing to contest the queenside. Black exchanges the bishop for the knight, disrupting white's pawn structure and simplifying the position. White recaptures with the c-pawn, creating doubled pawns but reinforcing the center. Black pushes the c-pawn, advancing on the queenside and aiming for pawnic play. White centralizes the knight, placing it on an active square and preparing for tactical operations. Black develops the bishop too, improving its diagonal control and putting pressure on white's position. White repositions the rook too, activating it on an open file and preparing for endgame play. Black advances the g-pawn, creating space on the kingside and preparing for pawnic advances. White captures the rook, winning material and simplifying the position. Black recaptures with the bishop, centralizing the piece and maintaining piece activity. White repositions the bishop, improving its scope and preparing for kingside expansion. Black advances the a-pawn, aiming to create queenside play and potentially a passed pawn. White solidifies the kingside with a pawn advance, preparing for king safety and central pawn support. Black advances the f-pawn, contesting the center and aiming for pawnic play. White develops the bishop too, centralizing the piece and improving its attacking potential. Black moves the king too, activating it and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. White advances the f-pawn, supporting the d-pawn and preparing for central pawn breaks. Black repositions the knight too, centralizing it and preparing to contest key squares. White centralizes the knight, improving its position and preparing for tactical operations. Black repositions the knight too, defending and preparing for future pawn advances. White activates the king, centralizing it for the endgame and preparing for pawnic activity. Black develops the bishop too, improving its position and creating threats. White advances the g-pawn, creating space on the kingside and preparing for king safety. Black activates the king, centralizing it for the endgame and preparing for pawn advances. White centralizes the king, preparing for aggressive pawn pushes and endgame operations. Black advances the king, centralizing it for the endgame and preparing for pawnic advances. White centralizes the king, preparing for aggressive pawn pushes and endgame operations. Black centralizes the king, actively participating in the endgame and preparing for pawn advances. White captures the pawn, advancing on the queenside and creating a passed pawn. Black centralizes the king, actively participating in the endgame and preparing for pawn advances. White captures the pawn, advancing on the kingside and creating a passed pawn. Black recaptures with the pawn, reinforcing the kingside and preparing for pawn advances. White captures the pawn, advancing on the queenside and gaining a significant advantage. Black recaptures with the knight, centralizing the piece and preparing for defense. White captures the pawn, advancing on the queenside and consolidating their advantage. Black captures the pawn, advancing on the kingside and attempting to create counterplay. White centralizes the king, preparing for aggressive pawn pushes and endgame operations. The move the king to h3 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to a4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the king takes on a4, executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to f4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the g-file takes on f4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the g-file takes on f4, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on f4 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White advances the c-pawn, creating a passed pawn and securing a decisive advantage. The move the king to g4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to a4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on c2, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the pawn to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to c5 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to a4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to f4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the g-file takes on f4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the g-file takes on f4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the bishop takes on a5, executes a favorable trade. This allows the king to f5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to f4 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to a4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to c6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to f4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the g-file takes on f4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the g-file takes on f4, executes a favorable trade. This allows the bishop to a5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, advancing on the kingside and consolidating their overwhelming winning advantage. The move the pawn on the g-file takes on f4 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to a4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the f-file takes on g5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on c2, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the bishop to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to f5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to c6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, advancing on the queenside and consolidating their overwhelming winning advantage. Black centralizes the king, actively participating in the endgame. But white's advantage is decisive.